Imagine a professional military force armed with automatic Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, marching into battle against an enemy that doesn't have guns, armor, or even a brain larger than a walnut. You'd bet your life on the soldiers, right? Well, in 1932, the Australian government made that same bet, and they lost. This isn't a parody or a bizarre fever dream. It is a 100% documented military operation known as the Great Emu War. When 20,000 emus invaded Western Australia's wheat fields, the Minister of Defence didn't send animal control. He sent the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. Led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, the soldiers expected a slaughter, but what they found was a feathered insurgency with better tactical awareness than most human infantries. Every time the soldiers set up their machine guns, the emus would split into tiny guerrilla squads, sprinting in different directions at 30 miles per hour, making it impossible to land a single hit. Major Meredith was stunned to observe that each flock had a designated sentry, a giant 6-foot-tall black bird that stood perfectly still, watching the soldiers' every move and signaling the others to retreat the moment a weapon was leveled. Even when the army tried mounting a machine gun on a moving truck to chase them down, the birds simply outmaneuvered them in the rough terrain. After weeks of wasted ammunition and mounting public embarrassment, the soldiers had to admit the unthinkable. They were being outsmarted by birds. Major Meredith famously remarked that if he had a division of men with the bullet-carrying capacity of these emus, he could face any army in the world. The military eventually retreated in total defeat, leaving the emus in full control of the territory, marking the first and only time in human history that a modern nation declared war on nature, and nature won by a landslide. But the humiliation didn't stop at just missing a few shots. The war turned into a literal slapstick tragedy as the soldiers realized these birds were essentially biological tanks. Major Meredith's men reported that even after being riddled with bullets, the emus would just keep sprinting like nothing happened, leading the major to claim the birds were invulnerable to anything but a direct hit to the skull. Desperate to end the stalemate, the military decided to go full Mad Max and mounted a Lewis gun on the back of a truck, hoping to mow down the flocks at high speed. It was a disaster. The truck couldn't keep up with the birds on the rugged terrain, the vibrations made it impossible for the gunner to aim, and the whole chase ended when a single emu got caught in the steering wheel, causing the vehicle to veer off course and crash into a fence. While the soldiers were fumbling with jammed guns and wrecked trucks, the emus were seen standing in the distance, seemingly mocking the humans with their strange, guttural calls. The Australian press started having a field day, mocking the government for losing a war to a flightless bird, but the government was too deep in to quit. They doubled down and sent the troops back in for a second attempt, but the emus had already learned the soldiers' patterns. The birds stopped gathering in large groups entirely. They started operating in cell structures, 2 or 3 birds here, 4 birds there, making the use of heavy machine guns not just overkill, but mathematically useless. Every bullet cost more than the wheat they were trying to save. As the casualty count for the emus remained embarrassingly low and the artillery bill skyrocketed, the realization finally sank in. The birds weren't just winning, they were making the Australian military look like amateurs on the world stage. The financial cost of this operation was spiraling into a total fiscal disaster, turning a simple pest control mission into a high-stakes capital expenditure gone wrong. As the bills for thousands of wasted rounds of ammunition piled up, the Australian taxpayers realized their government was essentially burning through their investment for zero return on equity. The war had become a massive liability, with the military's reputation hitting a market bottom as the press labeled it a ridiculous waste of public funds. Major Meredith was forced to watch his operational budget evaporate into the dusty Australian outback, while the emus continued their hostile takeover of the wheat industry, proving that nature's assets were far more resilient than human weaponry. The desperation reached its peak when the soldiers realized that every single bird killed was costing the government more than the total net worth of the crops they were trying to protect. It was a classic case of sunk cost fallacy. The government kept throwing resources at a losing battle simply because they were too embarrassed to admit that a bunch of birds had outmaneuvered their strategic planning. By the time the second campaign was launched, the emus had evolved into a decentralized resistance, spreading out so thin that the army's machine guns became an inefficient allocation of resources, firing at ghosts while the birds feasted on the profits of the farmers. The embarrassment wasn't just local, it was a global PR bankruptcy, as news of the army's retreat spread like wildfire, proving that no amount of military funding could defeat an enemy that simply refused to follow the rules of engagement. The failure of the campaign wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a total market crash for the Australian government's credibility. As the soldiers retreated for the final time, the emus remained the undisputed majority shareholders of the Western Australian wheat fields, leaving the human invaders with nothing but a massive deficit in their defense budget. The Minister of Defense attempted to spin the retreat as a tactical withdrawal, but the public saw it for what it truly was, a high-stakes economic loss with no hope of a bailout. The government had spent a fortune on logistics and manpower, only to realize that their leverage against nature was non-existent, turning the entire operation into a textbook example of a bad investment. Ultimately, the Emu War serves as a grim reminder of what happens when a leadership fails to perform a proper risk assessment before entering a volatile conflict. By the time the dust settled, the only thing the military had successfully liquidated was their own dignity, while the birds continued to graze on the farmers' liquid assets as if the army had never existed. It remains the only war in history where one side had all the firepower, but the other side held all the equity, proving that when it comes to raw survival, nature's bottom line is far more ruthless than any human treasury. In the end, Australia didn't just lose a war, they suffered a total hostile takeover by a flock of birds, leaving the world with a story that proves sometimes the most expensive lessons come with feathers.